April 14th, 1912. 11:40 at night. The North Atlantic is calm as a mirror of glass. So calm that there are no waves breaking against the floating icebergs, making them practically invisible in the moonless darkness. Aboard the largest passenger ship ever built by humanity, more than 2,200 souls are sailing toward their destiny. Some are sleeping in first-class cabins decorated with mahogany and velvet. Others are crammed into the tight bunks of third class, dreaming of a new life in America. No one knows that in less than 3 hours, the most luxurious ship in the world will be at the bottom of the ocean, taking 1,500 people with it. The Titanic disaster is more than a maritime tragedy. It is a story of hubris, of human arrogance in the face of nature, of business decisions that place profit and aesthetics above human lives. But above all, it is a story of one man whose choices, made years earlier in comfortable boardrooms, sealed the fate of thousands. A man who survived when so many others perished. A man who became the most controversial symbol of the greatest maritime disaster in peacetime history. His name was Joseph Bruce Ismay. And although he did not command the ship, did not design its hull, was not at the helm when the iceberg appeared in the darkness, the decisions he made as president of the White Star Line created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. This is the account of how a single man, driven by ambition, vanity, and negligence, contributed to the death of 1,500 people on a freezing April night. Joseph Bruce Ismay was born on December 12, 1862, in the town of Crosby, near Liverpool, England. He was not just any man. He was the eldest son of Thomas Henry Ismay, the founder of the White Star Line, one of the most prestigious shipping companies in the world. From childhood, Bruce was molded to inherit an empire. He studied at elite institutions, including Harrow School, one of the most exclusive schools in England. But the real education would come in the Liverpool offices, where his father built a fortune transporting passengers across the Atlantic. Thomas Ismay had acquired the name and flag of the White Star Line in 1867, when the original company went bankrupt. With vision and determination, he transformed the company into a synonym for luxury and reliability. White Star ships were not the fastest, but they were the most elegant, the most comfortable. When Thomas died in 1899, Bruce inherited not just a company, but also the responsibility of keeping it competitive in an increasingly fierce market. Bruce Ismay was 37 years old when he assumed full control of the White Star Line. He was a tall man of imposing appearance, with a well-trimmed mustache and impeccable clothing. But beneath the polished surface was a complex personality. Some described him as pompous and arrogant. Others noted his obsession with details and his refusal to accept criticism. He was a man accustomed to having his way, accustomed to his words being law. In 1902, Bruce Ismay made a decision that would forever change the fate of the White Star Line. He sold the company to the International Mercantile Marine Consortium, controlled by American tycoon J.P. Morgan. On the surface, it seemed like a betrayal of his father's heritage. But Ismay negotiated skillfully. He would remain as president of White Star and, in 1904, became president of the entire International Mercantile Marine conglomerate. Now, he did not command just one shipping company. He commanded a maritime empire that stretched across 2 continents. But the competition was brutal. Rival Cunard Line had launched 2 revolutionary ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. They were the fastest ships in the world, capable of crossing the Atlantic in less than 5 days. They won the Blue Ribbon, the prize given to the fastest ship to cross the ocean. White Star needed an answer. Ismay needed something that would make the world bow in admiration. He needed a ship that was not just large, but incomparable. A ship that would redefine the very concept of ocean travel. He could not compete in speed, so he would compete in size and luxury. On a summer evening in 1907, Bruce Ismay dined with William James Peary, president of Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipyard that built all White Star ships. That night, amid fine wines and cigars, the 2 men sketched plans for something extraordinary. They would not build just one ship. They would build 3 giant of the seas that would eclipse everything that came before. The Olympic-class ships would be the largest moving objects ever created by humanity. The strategy was clear. The new ships would be more than 269 meters long and weigh more than 46,000 tons. They would have a heated indoor swimming pool, a gymnasium with the most modern exercise equipment, elegant cafes modeled in Parisian style, a first-class lounge that rivaled European palaces, a grand staircase adorned with glass dome, an a la carte restaurant, private cabins with bathrooms, electric elevators, central heating. There would be floating hotels, but there was a fundamental problem that began to develop in the early stages of the project. To accommodate all this luxury, to create the grand lounges and spacious promenades that Ismay insisted on having, to maximize the space that could generate profit through cabins and entertainment areas, sacrifices had to be made. And the first sacrifice was made in the name of aesthetics and visual comfort for wealthy passengers. Alexander Carlisle was the general manager and one of the principal naval architects at Harland and Wolff. He was the one who coordinated the design details, the luxurious decorations, the safety equipment. Carlisle was an experienced man with more than 4 decades of work at the shipyard. He had supervised the construction of dozens of ships, and he was deeply concerned about the Olympic-class project. Ships of this size were something completely new in navigation history. The existing maritime regulations dated from 1894 and were created for much smaller ships. According to these outdated regulations, ships above 10,000 tons needed only 16 lifeboats. The Titanic would have more than 46,000 tons, almost 5 times the limit established by law. But the laws had not kept pace with the dizzying rate of technological innovation. Carlisle presented detailed plans to install 64 lifeboats on the Olympic-class ships. The design was ingenious and innovative. He had worked personally with the Welland Davit Company to create special davits, mechanisms that could hold multiple boats at each launching station. These davits could accommodate 4 boats stacked vertically. With 64 boats, each ship with a capacity to save all souls aboard, including passengers and crew, with considerable safety margin. It was sensible. It was responsible. It was exactly the kind of precaution any prudent person would take when building the largest ship in the world. But in March 1910, in a meeting that lasted only a few minutes and was recorded only in brief and sparse notes, the fate of 1,500 people was sealed with a pen. Bruce Ismay looked at Carlisle's plans and made a simple and devastating statement. 64 lifeboats would make the deck look cluttered and crowded. They obstructed the panoramic view of the ocean. They took up space that could be used for passengers to walk and enjoy the sea air. And, as Ismay supposedly said with a confident smile, people did not pay exorbitant prices to look at wooden lifeboats. Ismay had other justifications. Modern ships were virtually unsinkable thanks to watertight compartments. If the hull were punctured, automatic doors would close immediately, containing the water in an isolated section. The ship would remain afloat long enough for other ships to arrive for rescue. The North Atlantic routes were well frequented. There were always dozens of ships in the vicinity. The lifeboats were not to evacuate everyone aboard simultaneously. They were just to gradually transfer passengers to rescue ships that would certainly arrive within a few hours. Furthermore, there was the argument of legal compliance. The ships would still exceed the legal requirements established by the British Board of Trade. If the law required only 16 boats for ships of more than 10,000 tons, and White Star installed 20 boats, they would be technically in compliance and even exceeding regulatory expectations. From a legal standpoint, everything was correct. The number was methodically reduced, from 64 to 48, then to 32, then to just 16 rigid wooden boats, plus 4 collapsible canvas boats. A total of 20 vessels with combined capacity for only 1,178 people, on a ship designed to carry more than 3,300 souls when operating at maximum capacity. The mathematics was simple and absolutely terrifying. If something went catastrophically wrong, more than 2,000 passengers and crew would have no guaranteed place in a lifeboat. Alexander Carlisle protested, but only discreetly and without the necessary force. After all, the ship still exceeded the minimum legal requirements. He expressed his concerns in internal memos, but did not fight publicly against the decision. Years later, during inquiries into the disaster, Carlisle would admit that he should have been more insistent, more vocal in his objections. But at that moment, in 1910, he accepted Ismay's decision and moved forward. Carlyle retired from Harlan and Wolff in June 1910, officially for health reasons and to take care of family business. But persistent rumors suggested deep disagreements with Lord Peary about safety and design issues. Thomas Andrews, Peary's nephew and one of the company's most talented engineers, took over as chief naval architect. Andrews was a perfectionist, obsessed with every technical detail. But he inherited a project where the fundamental decisions about safety had already been made. Construction of the ships began. The Olympic was launched first in October 1910 and made its maiden voyage in June 1911. There were several successful voyages across the Atlantic. Passengers praised the incomparable luxury. Newspapers published articles extolling British ingenuity. This only reinforced everyone's confidence. The design worked perfectly. The ships were safe. Ismay's decision about the lifeboat seemed justified by practical experience. When the Titanic was completed in March 1912, it was considered virtually unsinkable by experts and laypeople alike. Technical magazines published detailed articles about the safety innovations. Popular newspapers called it a floating palace, the ship that God could not sink. Wealthy families from America and Europe competed fiercely for first-class cabins. Poor immigrants sold everything they owned to buy third-class tickets to the New World. The Titanic represented hope, progress, the supremacy of human engineering over the brute forces of nature. And Bruce Ismay, always attended to details in his company's image, decided to make the maiden voyage. It was not uncommon for him to accompany the first cruises of important White Star ships. It was a tradition, a way to personally supervise the service and ensure everything was perfect. But his presence aboard the Titanic would have consequences that no one could foresee in that moment of confidence and celebration. April 10th, 1912. Southampton, England, noon. The Titanic is docked at Pier 44, a mountain of black and white painted steel rising above the docks like a small vertical city. Passengers arrive in horse-drawn carriages and the most modern automobiles. Men with top hats and walking sticks. Women with extravagant hats decorated with feathers and flowers. Children with wide eyes of admiration, pointing at the four giant funnels. There are also the immigrants, entire families carrying battered suitcases and bundles tied with rope, speaking in Italian, Polish, Swedish, Syrian, Armenian. All share the same destination. New York, the land of infinite opportunity. Bruce Ismay boards like a king inspecting his most precious domain. He is not just a passenger. He is the owner of the line. He is the man whose decisions transformed this ship into reality. And he wants to be absolutely certain that everything is impeccable, that every detail corresponds to his vision. He visits the first-class cabins, inspects the elegant lounges, examines the decorations, tests the chairs, checks that the carpets are perfectly aligned. He speaks extensively with Captain Edward John Smith, the most senior and experienced commander of the White Star Line. Smith is 62 years old and about to retire after an illustrious career of 4 decades at sea. This will be his last voyage, an appropriate and glorious ending for an exemplary career commanding the largest and most luxurious ship in the world. Smith is respected and loved by all. Calm, competent, reliable, the kind of man in whom you would place your life without hesitation. The voyage begins without any significant incident. The Titanic sails majestically through the English Channel, makes its first stop in Cherbourg, France, collecting wealthy passengers who came from Paris. Then it proceeds to Queenstown, Ireland, where hundreds of Irish immigrants board, leaving behind everything they knew in search of a better life. Then, on April 11 at noon, the ship turns west and enters the vast and relentless Atlantic. Destination, New York. Distance, almost 3,000 kilometers of open ocean. Estimated arrival time, Wednesday, April 17th in the morning. The first days are absolutely perfect. The sea is as calm as rarely happens in the North Atlantic. The sky is clear, with only a few decorative white clouds. Passengers explore the ship, genuinely amazed at its impossible dimensions. They swim in the heated indoor pool, an incredible novelty on a ship. They exercise in the ultra-modern gymnasium, trying out the stationary bicycles and mechanical horses. They dine in restaurants that rivaled the best establishments in Paris and London. They take afternoon tea in elegant lounges while the orchestra plays. First-class passengers socialize, conduct business, plan brilliant futures. The poor in third class are also impressed. Their accommodations are basic, true, but they are still significantly better than on many other ships. There are clean beds, running water, hot meals served 3 times a day. For people who lived in rural hovels without electricity or plumbing, it is almost luxurious. There is music, dancing, palpable hope in the air, hope for jobs in America, hope for their own land, hope to escape the poverty but beneath this tranquil surface of confidence and celebration, mortal danger approaches silently. The North Atlantic in April is notoriously treacherous. The cold Labrador current brings icebergs from the Arctic, ice giants broken off from Greenland glaciers that float silently along the world's busiest shipping route. And in April 1912, there were significantly more icebergs than normal. A relatively mild winter had released unusual quantities of ice from the west coast of Greenland. Dozens of enormous ice masses floated directly in the Titanic's path. On April 14th, Sunday, the Titanic's radio operators begin receiving worrying warnings from other ships. At 9 in the morning, the ship Coronia sends a clear message: Captain Titanic. Westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, and field ice in latitude 42 north. Icebergs, smaller ice blocks, and ice fields at latitude 42 north. Captain Smith acknowledges the message and posts it on the bridge. It is recorded, but does not seem to cause great concern. Icebergs are common at this time of year. At 11:40 in the morning, the ship Nordam sends another warning about much ice in the same region. At 1:42 in the afternoon, the Baltic sends a more detailed message. Greek steamer Athenia reports passing icebergs and large quantities of field ice today in latitude 41 degrees 51 minutes north, longitude 49 degrees 52 minutes west. Captain Smith shows this specific message to Bruce Ismay. What happens next will be debated and analyzed for decades, becoming one of the most controversial moments of the entire tragedy. According to witnesses who survived the disaster, Ismay reads the message carefully and then, inexplicably, puts the paper in his vest pocket. He does not return it to Captain Smith immediately. During the day, he casually shows a message to some friends and acquaintances during social conversations, mentioning that they are sailing through waters with ice, as if it were just an interesting curiosity, a topic of conversation. The critical message about icebergs is only returned to Captain Smith at 7:30 in the evening, when Smith explicitly requests it. Some passengers, like Elizabeth Lyons, a first-class survivor, later claimed to have heard conversations between Smith and Ismay about increasing the ship's speed. The allegation was that Ismay wanted to arrive in New York on Tuesday night instead of Wednesday morning, generating positive publicity about the ship exceeding time expectations on its maiden voyage. Ismay would vehemently deny these specific accusations until the end of his life, stating that he never interfered with the captain's navigation decisions. But the documented facts are absolutely undeniable and form a disturbing pattern. Throughout April 14th, the Titanic received 6 different messages from other ships warning of dangerous ice on the ship's direct route. 6 clear, specific, and unequivocal warnings. And yet, inexplicably, the ship maintains its speed. 22 knots, approximately 41 kilometers per hour, almost maximum speed for the conditions. The Titanic is sailing faster than it had ever sailed. At 7 in the evening, the outside temperature drops abruptly, a classic sign that the ship is approaching ice fields. Experienced sailors know how to interpret this sign, but no order is given to reduce speed. Instead, at 7 o'clock in the evening, the last 3 main furnaces are connected to the main engines, increasing the ship's speed even further. All boilers are now active, something that had not happened at any previous moment of the voyage. This is not necessarily unusual or sinister in itself. Standard maritime practice of the time dictated that ships maintain their schedules rigorously. Delays cost significant money. Passengers had connections to make in New York. Companies depended on cargo arriving on time. Furthermore, There was a widespread, almost universal belief among experienced captains that icebergs represented relatively little danger to large modern steel ships. Collisions had occurred before, without serious consequences. In 1907, the large German transatlantic liner Kronprinz Wilhelm collided head-on with an iceberg and still completed the trip to New York with a dented nose but no casualties. Captain Smith himself had publicly declared in 1907, in an interview for a Maritime magazine, that he could not imagine any condition that could sink a modern ship. Modern shipbuilding had overcome the dangers of the sea. It was a characteristic arrogance of the Edwardian industrial era, the absolute belief that human technology had definitively conquered the unpredictable forces of nature. At 7:30 in the evening on Sunday, there is a large formal dinner in the first-class a la carte restaurant, the ship's most exclusive establishment. Millionaire George Widener and his wife Eleanor organize an elaborate party, apparently in honor of Captain Smith and to celebrate the magnificent voyage. The table is decorated with fresh flowers and gleaming silverware. Guests include John and Marion Thayer from Philadelphia, William and Lucille Carter from a prominent American family, and Major Archibald, but military aide to American President William Howard Taft. Bruce Ismay is also present at this elegant dinner. Multiple witnesses see him there, conversing animatedly and laughing, enjoying fine French wines while the ship tears through the frozen darkness at full speed. At 9 o'clock at night, when the sun has long since set and absolute darkness envelopes the ship, Captain Smith goes up the bridge and confers in detail with Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who is in command of the night watch. They agree they should be able to see any iceberg with enough time to avoid it, as long as the lookouts remain alert. The night is absolutely clear. No fog, no mist. Thousands of stars shine brightly. Smith gives clear instructions. If it becomes doubtful, if there is any uncertainty, notify me immediately. And then he leaves the bridge. He goes to his private cabin, which is conveniently located just behind the bridge. He is available to be called at any time, but is not actively on watch. At 9:40 at night, another crucial warning arrives via radio. The ship Mesaba sends a desperate and detailed message. Latitude 42 north to 41 degrees 25 minutes. Longitude 49 to 50 degrees west. Much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs. Also field ice. Weather good, clear. This message places icebergs precisely in the Titanic's current position. But the radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, are absolutely overloaded sending personal messages from wealthy passengers. The Titanic's radio system was operated by the Marconi Company, which profited from private messages. Commercial messages had priority over navigation warnings. The critical message from the Mesaba is set aside, pinned under a paperweight on the desk, never reaching the bridge. At 10 o'clock at night, Second Officer Lightoller is replaced by First Officer William Murdoch in command of the bridge. Lightoller casually mentions they will probably encounter ice during Murdoch's watch. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee climb to the observation post in the Crow's Nest, 45 meters above the deck. They do not have binoculars. The binoculars were locked in a locker, and the key is with an officer who is no longer on the ship, having been transferred before the voyage. The lookouts will have to rely only on their naked eyes in the frozen darkness. At 10:20, Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall visits Captain Smith in the chart room. They discuss the ship's exact position and verify navigation calculations. Everything is perfectly normal. Everything is under absolute control. The Titanic is exactly where it should be, making exactly the planned speed. There is no reason for concern. And then, at 11:40 at night, in the complete darkness of a moonless night, Lookout Frederick Fleet sees something disturbing in the darkness ahead. A dark shape, a black shadow against a starry sky. For a terrible moment of uncertainty, he is not sure what he is seeing. Then, with a shock of terror, he realizes it is ice, a mountain of ice. He rings the warning bell 3 times, the universal signal for immediate danger ahead. Simultaneously, he grabs a telephone that connects directly to the bridge and dials frantically. The phone rings on the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch is in command of the bridge when the phone rings sharply. He picks up the receiver with a steady hand and hears the three words that every maritime officer dreads: "Iceberg right ahead." Fleet's voice is tense but controlled. Murdoch does not hesitate for even a second. He acts with the speed of his years of experience. He shouts rapid orders: "Full astern, hard a port." On the engine telegraph, he pulls the levers violently backward. In the engine compartments below, alarms sound shrilly. The enormous triple expansion engines roar in protest when the power is dramatically reversed. The rudder turns sharply, the hydraulic mechanism responding to the order. But the Titanic is not a small, agile fishing boat. It is a giant of 46,000 tons sailing at 22 knots through the water. Fundamental physics cannot be denied or deceived. The ship begins to turn, but slowly, terribly, agonizingly slowly. Momentum is massive. In the frozen darkness ahead, the iceberg grows larger and larger in everyone's view on the bridge. Frederick Fleet watches absolutely horrified from the crow's nest as the ship approaches inexorably toward the massive ice. 37 seconds. That is the time calculated later between Fleet's initial warning and the inevitable impact. 37 seconds to change the course of a ship 269 meters long. 37 seconds to avoid the fate of 1,500 people. It is mathematically impossible. The Titanic turns enough to avoid a direct frontal collision, which would have crushed the bow but possibly kept the ship afloat. But it does not turn enough to completely avoid the killer iceberg. At 11:40 at night on April 14, 1912, the starboard side of the Titanic scrapes against the submerged iceberg. For the vast majority of passengers on the upper decks, it seems like just a small, strange bump, as if the ship had passed over something in the water. Some feel an unusual vibration. Others hear a prolonged scratching sound, like a giant sandpaper being dragged along the hull. Some pieces of ice break off and fall onto the well deck. Curious third-class passengers leave their cabins, pick up the frozen pieces and play with them, laughing and making jokes about having hit ice. But below the waterline, invisible to everyone except the terrified workers in the lower compartments, something absolutely catastrophic is happening. The iceberg does not tear a long, dramatic cut in the hull, as early theories suggested, and as was depicted in films for decades. Instead, the complex collision creates a series of openings and cracks in the steel plates that cover the hull. The force of impact is not sufficient to tear the steel completely, but it is more than enough to separate the junctions between the plates. The rivets that hold the plates together break and come loose. Many of these rivets were made of iron, not the more resistant steel, a cost-saving decision that now exacts its terrible price. Frigid Atlantic water begins to enter in powerful torrents through the openings. 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments are breached by the collision. Cargo compartment number 1, right at the front. Cargo compartment number 2. Cargo compartment number 3. Boiler room number 6. Boiler room number 5. Boiler room number 4. 6 compartments open to the furious sea. The Titanic was meticulously designed by Thomas Andrews to remain afloat with up to 4 compartments completely flooded. It was a generous safety margin. With 6 compartments open to the ocean, the ship is mathematically doomed. Water begins to enter in massive torrents. First in the forward cargo compartment, where there are barely any crew to witness. Then in the boiler rooms, where the stokers and engineers work in grueling shifts. The workers in these rooms flee in absolute panic as the freezing water pursues them fiercely. The sound is deafening, a roar of pressurized water invading confined spaces. Some men cannot escape in time. The automatic watertight doors close quickly when sensors detect flooding, cutting off the escape route for some unfortunate workers. They become trapped in the rapidly filling compartments, desperately pounding on the steel doors as the water rises to their chests, then to their necks. Captain Smith runs to the bridge from his adjacent cabin, still wearing his dinner uniform. "What happened?" he asks urgently. Murdoch reports the collision in precise detail and the evasive actions he took. Smith orders an immediate and complete inspection of the ship. For a few precious and deceptive minutes, there is tenuous hope. Fourth Officer Boxall does a quick inspection of the passenger decks and returns saying he found no visible damage. There is no water in the corridors. There are no signs of panic. Perhaps it was just a superficial scrape. But this relief is terribly brief. Thomas Andrews, the naval architect who knows every inch of the Titanic as if it were his own body, is also aboard as technical supervisor on his final inspection voyage before the ship enters full commercial service. Andrews immediately descends to the lower decks and sees the water rising rapidly in the cargo compartments and engine rooms. He examines the situation with his trained engineer's eye. When he returns to the bridge, his face is visibly pale. He takes Captain Smith to the private chart room and unrolls the detailed technical plans of the ship on the table. With 6 compartments completely flooded, Andrews explains in a tense voice, "The mathematics is absolutely inevitable and relentless. The water will fill the forward compartments completely, pulling the bow down at an increasingly steep angle. As the bow sinks progressively, the water will overflow the bulkheads that do not extend to the upper decks. The bulkheads were built only up to each deck, not to the top of the ship. One compartment will overflow and flood the next and the next, and the next in an unstoppable cascade of destruction. It is like a tilted ice cube tray. The water will simply flow from one compartment to the next until the weight is unsustainable." "How long do we have?" asks Smith in a controlled but tense voice. Andrews does the calculations mentally, considering the volume of the compartments, the rate of water entry, the remaining buoyancy. "An hour," he responds after a terrible pause. "Possibly an hour and a half. 2 at most if we're lucky. No more than that." It is 15 minutes after midnight when Captain Smith, finally accepting the inevitable, gives the order that no one ever expected to have to give on a ship considered unsinkable. Uncover the lifeboats. Prepare for evacuation. The crew rushes to comply with the order, but many are visibly confused and untrained. There have been no adequate and comprehensive training with all crew members. The complete lifeboat drill that was scheduled for Sunday morning, April 14th, was inexplicably canceled by Captain Smith. The official reason was never fully clarified. Many crew members do not know exactly what to do. Instructions are contradictory and confusing. How many people can each boat really carry safely? The official capacity is 65 people, but the boats had never been tested with that load. Who should get into the boats first? Is there any established priority? Should the boats be filled while still on deck, or should they be launched partially empty and filled after they are in the water? No one has definitive answers. At 12:05 in the morning, 10 crucial minutes after the initial order, Smith finally instructs radio operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to send distress calls to any ship within range. Phillips, a 25-year-old young man, immediately begins transmitting in Morse code. CQD, CQD. It is a traditional British maritime distress code. Later, Harold Bride suggests also sending SOS, the new international distress code that was being gradually adopted. The messages crackle through the night ether. "We have struck an iceberg. We are sinking rapidly. Position latitude 41 degrees 46 minutes north. Longitude 50 degrees 14 minutes west. We need immediate assistance." Several ships sailing the Atlantic receive the distress signal. The closest is a Californian, only 19 kilometers away, so close that the Titanic's emergency flares can be seen from its deck. But tragically, the Californian's only radio operator, Cyril Evans, went to sleep 20 minutes ago. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, sees strange lights and flares on the horizon, but does not wake the radio operator to investigate. No one aboard the Californian hears the desperate pleas for help. The Carpathia, commanded by Captain Arthur Rostron, is 88 kilometers away when it receives the message. Rostron acts immediately and decisively. He orders the ship to turn completely and sail at absolute maximum speed toward the Titanic's position. But even sailing at full speed through dangerous waters full of icebergs, it will take approximately 4 hours to arrive. 4 hours at the Titanic simply does not have. Meanwhile, on the Titanic's decks, chaos is slowly beginning to develop. Passengers were instructed through calls in the corridors and knocks on cabin doors to put on life vests and go to the boat deck. Stewards walk through the corridors shouting instructions. But many passengers, especially those in comfortable first-class cabins, do not take the warning completely seriously. The ship seems so solid, so stable, so safe. There is no noticeable list yet. The engines are still running, generating electric light. The orchestra has begun playing cheerful music in the lounge to keep people calm. Some passengers, especially the elderly, categorically refuse to leave their heated and luxurious cabins for the brutal cold of the night. The outside temperature is several degrees below freezing. The air is biting. Others obediently go to the boat deck, but deeply reluctant to get into the small wooden boats swinging in the air suspended by cables. The boat seems so fragile, so tiny compared to the huge, solid ship. Many passengers genuinely prefer to stay on the large, apparently safe ship. And it is precisely here that Bruce Ismay's decision, made years earlier in a comfortable boardroom in London, begins to show its absolutely horrible and deadly consequences. There are only 20 lifeboats aboard. Total combined capacity for 1,178 people on a ship carrying 2,224 souls. Even if each boat is launched completely full to maximum capacity, more than 1,000 people will have nowhere to go. 12:45 in the morning. Second Officer Charles Lightoller is on the port side of the ship, supervising the boats under his responsibility. Lightoller is an officer of the old school, rigid, inflexible in the rules. He interprets the traditional maritime order: women and children first, absolutely literally. Only women and children. Men cannot enter under any circumstances, even when there are no women or children available in the immediate area, even when families plead to stay together. He categorically refuses to allow men to enter. The boats are lowered with empty seats, while desperate men watch from the doomed deck. On the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch is more pragmatic in his approach. Women and children have absolute priority, but if there are none immediately available in the area, men can enter to prevent the boats from leaving empty. Still, due to confusion, fear, people's reluctance to enter the boats, many are launched significantly below capacity. Boat number 1 has technical capacity for 40 people, but is launched with only 12 occupants. Boat number 6 was designed for 65, but leaves with only 28 people. It is a tragic and fatal waste of precious space. Why would the boats not fill completely? Lightoller would later testify at official inquiries that he was genuinely concerned that the support mechanisms holding the boats, the well-endowed company davits, could collapse and break if they were loaded with 65 people while still suspended high above the deck. He planned to launch the boats partially filled and then maneuver the ship so that rope ladders would allow more people to descend and enter after the boats were safely floating in the water. But this additional order was never clearly communicated to crew members responsible for rowing the boats. The boats simply rowed away from the dying ship. There's also chaotic confusion about exactly where people should go to reach the boat decks. The Titanic is a complex vertical labyrinth of corridors, stairs, elevators. Third-class passengers, housed in the depth of the ship, are literally locked behind iron gates on the lower decks. This is not deliberate cruelty or conspiracy against the poor. Strict United States immigration laws require that third-class passengers be kept physically separated from first- and second-class passengers throughout the voyage to prevent the spread of infectious diseases like typhus and cholera. But in a mortal emergency, these legally required gates become absolutely fatal barriers. Some conscientious crew members unlock the gates and guide third-class passengers through the confusing corridors to the boat deck. Daniel Buckley, an Irish survivor, described how a steward guided them through narrow passages and stairs to reach the upper decks. But other crew members, following the rules even as the ship sinks inexorably, keep the gates firmly closed. Entire families are trapped behind iron bars as the water slowly rises toward them. The final statistics tell the devastating story of inequality in death. 63% of first-class children survived the disaster. Only 34% of third-class children had the same fortune. Of the 144 first-class women aboard, only 4 died. Of the 179 third-class women, 89 perished. Social class literally determined who would live and who. Meanwhile, Bruce Ismay is on the boat deck during the crucial moments of evacuation. Multiple independent witnesses see him actively helping to load women and children into the boats. He works side by side with 5th Officer Harold Lowe and other crew members, taking passengers by the arms and helping them enter the wooden vessels. For a moment frozen in time, it seems that Ismay is doing exactly what is right. It seems he is fulfilling his duty as president of the line, remaining on the ship until the bitter end. But at 1:40 in the morning, approximately 2 hours after the collision, everything changes irrevocably. Collapsible boat C, one of the canvas boats with sides that can be raised, is being prepared on the starboard side near the bridge. It is one of the last boats available. The situation on the ship is becoming visibly desperate. The Titanic's bow is now clearly submerged. The water has already completely covered the well deck. The ship is tilted at a noticeable and growing angle. There is no longer any denying the terrible reality. The Titanic is dying. Chief Officer Henry Wilde and First Officer Murdoch are supervising Collapsible C. They call out repeatedly in loud voices, women and children to the boat. Several women enter hesitantly, but there is visible and understandable reluctance. The deck is still relatively high above the dark and frozen water. The boat seemed terribly fragile. Some women absolutely refuse to leave their husband behind. There are approximately 40 people in Collapsible C when the officers decide they cannot wait any longer. Every second counts now. The ship could break and sink at any moment. Murdoch shouts, "Are there any more women?" Last call for women. There's a tense pause. No one comes forward. And then, in this moment that will define the rest of his life and his historical reputation, Bruce Ismay steps forward and enters the boat. What exactly happened in this crucial moment has been passionately debated for more than a century. Witnesses gave contradictory and conflicting accounts. Ismay himself would consistently claim that it helped fill the boat, that no woman was visible in the immediate area, that Officer Murdoch made no objection when he entered. He simply stepped into a boat that was about to be launched anyway. There was no reason to remain on deck and die when there was available space. But other witnesses told a different and much more damning story. Passenger Hugh Woolner claimed to have seen Ismay practically jumping into the boat at the last possible second. Colonel Archibald Gracie testified that there were women and children still on deck when the boat was launched. Passenger George Reams wrote that Ismay sneaked into the boat and tried to hide at the bottom among the women. What is absolutely indisputable is that Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line, owner of the ship, survived when 1,500 passengers and crew perished. He survived when Captain Smith remained on the ship until the end. He survived when Thomas Andrews, the naval architect, refused to try to save his own life. He survived when hundreds of third-class men, who never even had a chance to reach the boat decks, died drowned in the depths of the ship. Collapsible C slowly rose away from the dying Titanic. Ismay is sitting with his back to the doomed ship, unable or unwilling to watch the horror unfolding. As the boat moves away rowing, the Titanic is in its absolutely agonizing final moments. The bow is completely submerged now. The deck angle is getting steeper every passing minute. The people who remained aboard begin to slide down the tilted deck. Some fall into the frozen ocean. Others desperately cling to anything fixed. At 2:05 in the morning, the Titanic's lights flicker and then go out completely when the water finally reaches the engine rooms and the generators fail. Absolute darkness envelopes the ship except for the starlight. At 2:18, the ship finally breaks in half between the third and fourth funnels. The stress of the raised stern's weight in the air is too great for the hull to bear. There's a sound of tearing and breaking metal that can be heard miles away. The forward section sinks rapidly. The rear section floats for a few moments before also sliding beneath the waves. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the Titanic completely disappears beneath the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. 500 people are in the water, screaming, begging for help. The sound is indescribable. Witnesses in the boats described it as the worst sound they had ever heard in their lives. Screams that gradually diminish as hypothermia kills people in the water within minutes. The water temperature is -2 degrees Celsius. Most people lose consciousness in 15 minutes and die in less than 30. Of the 20 boats that were successfully launched, only one returns to try to rescue survivors from the water. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe transfers passengers from his boat to other boats to have more space, then rows back. He manages to save only 4 people alive. All the others in the other boats simply row away, fearing they will be swamped and sunk by desperate people in the water. At 3:30 in the morning, the Carpathia finally arrives at the position where the Titanic sank. Captain Rostron sailed through iceberg fields in absolute darkness, risking his own ship to arrive as quickly as possible. They begin collecting the boats and their occupants. The process takes hours. Many people are in deep shock. Some cannot speak. Children cry for parents who are no longer there. Husbands desperately search for wives. Wives for husbands. When the last boat is collected at dawn, the final count is made. 706 survivors. 1,517 dead. The greatest maritime disaster in peacetime in recorded history. Among the dead are some of the richest men in the world. John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in America, died. Benjamin Guggenheim, mining magnate, died. Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida, who refused to leave him, both died. Captain Smith died. Thomas Andrews died. The entire orchestra died, having played until final minutes. And Bruce Ismay survived, aboard the Carpathia. Ismay is in a state of severe shock. He locks himself in a cabin and refuses to leave. The ship's doctor finds him in a catatonic state and gives him opioids for sedation. Ismay remains isolated during the entire 3-day voyage to New York, refusing to speak with other survivors or with the press that was already beginning to formulate difficult questions. When the Carpathia docks in New York on the evening of April 18th, 10,000 people are waiting on the piers. There are reporters shouting questions. There are crying relatives looking for loved ones. There is palpable anger in the air. Rumors are already beginning to circulate about what really happened on that terrible night. Rumors about boats launched half empty. Rumors about third-class passengers locked up. Rumors about a certain gentleman who saved his own life while women and children died. The next day, April 19th, the United States Senate convenes an emergency investigation. Senator William Alden Smith from Michigan is chosen to preside. Smith is not a maritime expert. He is a farmer who became a politician. But he is tenacious, determined, and absolutely furious about what happened. He issues immediate subpoenas for all surviving officers and crew of the Titanic before they can return to England. He wants answers. The American people demand answers. Bruce Ismay is the first principal witness called. During 2 days of brutal interrogation, Smith asked direct and accusatory questions. Why did you get into the boat when there were women and children still aboard? Did you not have a moral responsibility to remain on the ship? Did you pressure Captain Smith to maintain high speed despite ice warnings? Why were there so few lifeboats? Did you place profit above safety? Ismay maintains his external composure, but is visibly shaken. He vehemently denies having interfered with the captain's navigation decisions. He claims he entered the boat only when there were no more visible women in the area. He explains that the number of boats exceeded legal requirements. Technically, legally, he did nothing wrong, but his answers sound defensive, evasive, hollow. The American press has no mercy. Newspapers begin calling him Jay. Brute Ismay, a cruel pun on Bruce that means brute. Editorial cartoons show him stepping on women and children to get into a boat. A Chicago newspaper writes, Charles Mitchell stole more from us than any bank robber in history. A robber takes a bag of money, but Ismay took the future from an entire generation. The New York American publishes, a gentleman would have remained on the ship. Ismay preferred life to honor. The British investigation that followed in May and June 1912 was more restrained in tone, but no less devastating in its conclusions about systemic failures. Lord Mersey, who presided over the inquiry, concluded that the ship was traveling too fast given the known presence of ice, that there were insufficient lifeboats, that the evacuation was poorly organized, that regulatory changes were urgently needed. As for Ismay personally, Mersey declared that his entry into the boat did not violate any law, but diplomatically added that perhaps it would have been better if he had found another way to act. It was a veiled condemnation, a suggestion that, although technically legal, his actions were morally questionable. For Bruce Ismay, these moderate words did not matter. The court, that really mattered had already rendered its verdict, the court of public opinion, and the verdict was absolute guilt. He became the living symbol of everything that was wrong with that terrible night, the personification of corporate greed, negligence, cowardice. On the streets of New York and London, he was booed when recognized. He received hate mail daily. One woman wrote, "I hope you never sleep peacefully for the rest of your life." In June 1913, only 14 months after the disaster, Bruce Ismay resigned as president of the White Star Line and president of the International Mercantile Marine. Officially, it was for health reasons, but everyone knew the truth. He had become an impossible liability for the company. His presence was a constant reminder of the tragedy. Passengers refused to travel on White Star ships, while Ismay was associated with the company. Ismay withdrew completely from public life. He and his wife Florence moved to an isolated house in Ireland, far from London and hostile crowds. He rarely went out. When he did, he wore simple disguises. He never spoke publicly about the Titanic again. When asked by friends or family, he changed the subject immediately. It was as if that night had been erased from his memory, although it clearly haunted him daily. But the real tragedy, the cruel irony of Bruce Ismay's story, is that he was simultaneously guilty and innocent. Guilty because his decisions years earlier created the conditions for the disaster. The reduction of lifeboats from 64 to 20, the emphasis on luxury over safety, the corporate culture that prioritized schedules and profits over precaution. These were Ismay's decisions, and 1,500 people paid with their lives. But he was also innocent in a broader sense, because Ismay did not alone create the culture of technological arrogance that dominated the Edwardian era. He did not invent the outdated maritime regulations that allowed giant ships to operate with the same safety requirements as ships 5 times smaller. He was not the only executive who placed profits above lives. It was systemic. Ismay simply was the human face of a flawed system. The Titanic disaster fundamentally changed the maritime industry forever. In January 1914, the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was held in London, known by the acronym SALAS. Representatives from 13 nations gathered to establish new safety standards. The changes were radical and comprehensive. From then on, all passenger ships would have to have enough lifeboats for all souls aboard, not just the previous legal minimum. Lifeboat drills would be mandatory for passengers and crew on every voyage. Radio operators would have to maintain watch 24 hours a day. The International Ice Patrol was established, a service financed by several nations to monitor and report iceberg positions in the North Atlantic. Maritime routes were altered to pass further south during spring and early summer months, when icebergs are most prevalent. Insurance companies began requiring much more rigorous standards. The entire philosophy of naval design changed, with safety finally receiving priority it should always have had. But for the 1,500 people who died on that frozen April night, these changes came too late. For the widows and orphans left behind, the new regulations were cold comfort. For Bruce Ismay, the reforms were a daily reminder of his role in the tragedy. Ismay lived another 43 years after the disaster. 43 years of relative isolation. He occasionally appeared at charity events, especially those related to sailors and their families. He donated significant amounts of money anonymously to Titanic victim relief funds. But he never spoke publicly about that night. His close friends reported that he had regular nightmares, that he would wake up screaming, that he drank heavily, that he suffered from deep depression. One visitor described finding him sitting alone in his library, staring into space, tears silently streaming. Florence Ismay, his wife, remained loyally by his side during all these difficult decades. She never spoke publicly in his defense, but in private letters to close friends, she described the torment her husband experienced daily. "Bruce carries the weight of 1,500 souls on his shoulders every day," she wrote in 1925. "He will never find peace in this life." In 1936, at 74 years old, Ismay suffered a debilitating stroke that left him partially paralyzed. His health deteriorated rapidly in the following months. In October 1937, Bruce Ismay died at his isolated home in Ireland at 74 years old. Until his final moments, according to those who were present, He murmured unintelligible words about water and ice, about people screaming in the darkness, about boats that never returned. His obituary in the London Times was surprisingly brief for a man who had been so prominent. A few lines about his career at the White Star Line, a mention of the Titanic, no celebration of his achievements, no warm tributes. It was as if the world was eager to forget Bruce Ismay as soon as he departed. He was discreetly buried in a cemetery in Putney Vale, London. There was no public funeral. There were no crowds of mourners, only immediate family and a few loyal friends. His headstone is simple, with no mention of the Titanic, no reference to the White Star Line, just his name and birth and death dates, as if he wanted to erase his own history. But history has not forgotten Bruce Ismay, and perhaps it should not forget, because his story is not just about one man or one ship. It is about the choices we make when we place profit above safety, when we prioritize appearances over substance, when we trust excessively in technology and forget that nature will always have the last word. The White Star Line, the company that Thomas Ismay built and that Bruce inherited, never fully recovered from the Titanic disaster. The third ship of the Olympic class, the Britannic, was completed in 1914, but was immediately requisitioned as a hospital ship during World War I. In 1916, it struck a naval mine in the Aegean Sea and sank. Fortunately, this time there were more than enough lifeboats. Only 30 people died out of 1,066 aboard. The Olympic, the first ship of the class that had inspired so much confidence, continued in service until 1935. During World War I, it served as a troop transport and even rammed and sank a German submarine, but was always haunted by the memory of its sister ship. Passengers avoided cabins that corresponded to those where people had died on the Titanic. The crew whispered about ghosts in the corridors. In 1934, facing impossible financial difficulties during the Great Depression, the White Star Line merged with its old rival, the Cunard Line. It was the end of an era. The White Star flag, which had flown proudly on the oceans for more than 60 years, was lowered for the last time. The Olympic was dismantled for scrap in 1937, the same year Bruce Ismay died. It was as if both the man and the ship were intrinsically linked in life and death. The cultural impact of the Titanic disaster was immense and lasting. Before 1912, there was an almost religious belief in unlimited technological progress. The idea that human engineering could overcome any natural obstacle, that science had made man absolute master of his destiny. The Titanic destroyed this illusion brutally and permanently. The tragedy coincided with the end of the Edwardian era, that golden period of optimism and confidence that preceded World War I. Many historians argue that the sinking of the Titanic was the first blow against that excessive confidence. 2 years later, the Great War would completely destroy the old world. But the Titanic was a harbinger, the first sign that human arrogance had mortal limits. The individual stories of heroism and cowardice on that night became legends. Benjamin Guggenheim, who dressed in his best tuxedo and declared he would die as a gentleman. Ida Strauss, who refused a place in a lifeboat to remain with her husband Isidore, saying, "Where you go, I go." The orchestra that continued playing while the ship sank, offering musical comfort until the end. Radio operator Jack Phillips, who remained at his post sending distress calls until the water invaded the radio room. And then there were the darker stories. First-class passengers who supposedly bribed crew to secure places in boats. Men who disguised themselves as women to enter the boats. Boats that rowed away from people screaming in the water, fearing being swamped. Humanity at its best and worst, exposed under the extreme stress of imminent catastrophe. But returning to Bruce Ismay, who personified both the cause and consequences of disaster, we must ask a fundamental question. Was he really solely responsible? The answer is simultaneously yes and no, in complex and contradictory ways. Yes, because the specific decisions created the direct conditions for the massive number of deaths. If Ismay had insisted on the 64 lifeboats that Alexander Carlisle originally proposed, virtually everyone aboard could have been saved. The mathematics is undeniable. With capacity for approximately 3,500 people in boats, and only 2,200 aboard that voyage, there would have been abundant space for everyone. Children would not have died. Families would not have been separated. The disaster would still be tragic, but it would not be the massacre it became. Yes, because Ismay created and perpetuated a corporate culture that prioritized appearances and profits over safety. The decision to reduce the boats was not isolated. It was symptomatic of a larger business philosophy. Every inch of the Titanic that could generate revenue was maximized. Every safety element that could be minimized was reduced to the legal minimum. Third-class passengers were accommodated in conditions that, although better than many ships, still reflected the attitude that poor lives were worth less investment. But no, because Ismay operated within a regulatory system that permitted and even encouraged these choices. The British regulations from 1894 were absurdly outdated. They were written when 10,000-ton ships were giants. No one imagined 46,000-ton ships. The British Board of Trade had 18 years to update these regulations as ships grew. It did not. Ismay simply exploited the loopholes the government left open. No, because the belief that modern ships were virtually unsinkable was universal, not just Ismay's. The best naval engineers of the time shared this confidence. Thomas Andrews, who died on the ship, had designed the watertight compartment specifically to make the ship capable of surviving collisions. The system would work if only 4 compartments were breached. No one imagined a scenario where 6 compartments would be open simultaneously. No, because the decision to maintain speed despite ice warnings was not Ismay's alone. It was standard maritime practice of the time. Dozens of captains did the same thing routinely. Captain Smith himself, widely respected and experienced, made the final decision about speed. Ismay may have expressed desire to arrive early in New York, but there is no conclusive evidence that he ordered Smith to ignore ice warnings. And no, because when the disaster happened, when the ship was sinking, Ismay did not cause the evacuation chaos. He did not create the confusion about how to fill the boats. He was not responsible for the lack of crew training. He did not lock the gates that prevented third-class passengers from reaching the upper decks. These were systemic failures of training, communication, and organization. As for his own survival, this remains the most controversial and debated aspect of the entire story. Ismay technically had the legal right to enter that boat. There were no women or children immediately visible in the specific area where Boat C was being loaded. Officer Murdoch did not stop him. According to maritime laws and the formal social codes of the time, he did not violate any explicit rule, but there was an unwritten moral code, especially for men of his class and social position. The code that said gentlemen should sacrifice themselves for ladies, that people of responsibility should remain until the end, that the captain and owners were the last to leave the ship. This code was not written in law, but was deeply engraved in Victorian and Edwardian consciousness, and Ismay violated it. Thousands of men remained on the Titanic's deck, knowing they were going to die. They remained because there were not enough boats. They remained so that women and children could live. They remained because it was what was expected of them. Thomas Andrews, the naval architect who designed the ship, remained. He could easily have entered a boat early, using his technical authority as justification. He did not. Captain Smith remained. Hundreds of crew remained. And 1,500 men, women, and children who never had a choice remained. Ismay chose to live. And that choice, more than any previous business decision, defined how he would be remembered by history. Not as the man who democratized luxury ocean travel. Not as a visionary businessman who built the largest ships in the world. But as the man who got into a lifeboat while others died. There's a final question we must consider. Did Bruce Ismay learn anything from tragedy? Did he change as a person? There is evidence that yes, although discreetly. In the years following the disaster, he donated substantial sums of money to maritime charities. He financially supported widows and orphans of sailors. He contributed to hospitals and retirement homes for retired crew. All of this done anonymously, without seeking public recognition. Friends reported that he became much more humble. The arrogance and pomp that characterized his pre-Titanic personality completely disappeared. He no longer spoke with absolute certainty. He no longer made grand declarations. He lived quietly, almost like a hermit, avoiding attention. But he never publicly admitted responsibility. He never said the words so many wanted to hear. I was wrong. My decisions killed people. I should have done differently. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was fear of legal proceedings. Or perhaps, as some suggested, he genuinely believed he had done everything right within the laws and norms of his time. Today, more than a century after the disaster, we can look at Bruce Ismay's story with more nuance than contemporaries could. We can see that he was simultaneously villain and victim. Villain because his choices directly contributed to 1,500 deaths. Victim because he was made scapegoat for systemic failures much larger than one man. The true lesson of the Titanic and Bruce Ismay is not about a bad man making malicious choices. It is about how good people can make terrible decisions when operating within systems that value profit over safety. About how technological arrogance can blind even the most intelligent. About how small economies and conveniences can have catastrophic consequences. It is about how, when we face choices between right and convenient, between safety and appearance, between responsibility and profit, we must always choose what is right, even when it is expensive, even when it disrupts plans, even when other people are doing differently. And it is about how, in the end, we cannot escape the consequences of our choices. Bruce Ismay got into that lifeboat and saved his physical life. But he lost something much greater. He lost his reputation. He lost his peace of mind. He lost any chance of being remembered for his real achievements. He lived another 43 years, but in many ways he was dead since that April night of 1912. The Titanic rests at the bottom of the Atlantic at a depth of 3,800 meters. The pressure, there is almost 400 atmospheres. The temperature is just above freezing. It is an environment so hostile that few creatures can survive. The ship is slowly disintegrating, corroded by bacteria that eat iron. Eventually, nothing will remain but a rust stain on the ocean floor. But the lessons of the Titanic, if we choose to learn them, are permanent. The lesson that technology, however advanced, cannot replace caution and respect for nature. The lesson that safety regulations must evolve as rapidly as technology. The lesson that luxury and appearances should never have priority over human lives. The lesson that every person in a leadership position, whether in business, government, or in the area, carries a moral responsibility that transcends laws and profits. The decisions we make affect real lives. And when we make wrong decisions, when we prioritize what is convenient over what is right, people die. Bruce Ismay had to live with his choices every day for the remaining 43 years of his life. Every morning he woke up was a reminder that he lived while 1,500 others did not. Every news about the Titanic, every anniversary of the tragedy, every encounter with a survivor or relative of victims, every nightmare about frozen water, and people screaming in the darkness. We can learn from his story without repeating his mistakes. We can build ships, airplanes, buildings, technologies of all kinds, but always putting safety first. Always questioning when someone suggests economizing on safety equipment. Always updating regulations to keep pace with innovations. Always remembering that behind every statistic, every number, every business decision, there are real human lives. Bruce Ismay's final legacy should not be just shame and condemnation. It should be a warning. A permanent reminder of what happens when we place profit above people, when we let arrogance overcome prudence, when we believe we are smarter than nature, when we make small economies that have large consequences. If we can learn these lessons, then the 1,500 people who died on that frozen April night will not have died completely in vain. Their deaths taught us to be more careful, more humble, more conscious of our responsibilities to others. That is a legacy worth preserving. So next time you hear about a company cutting safety costs to increase profits, remember Bruce Ismay and his 64 lifeboats reduced to 20. Next time you hear someone say that technology has made something perfectly safe, remember the unsinkable ship that sank in less than 3 hours. Next time you witness someone in a position of power making choices that put others at risk, remember 1,500 people at the bottom of the Atlantic. History does not repeat exactly, but it certainly rhymes. The lessons of the Titanic resonate. Today, perhaps more than ever, In our era of algorithms making decisions about lives, of artificial intelligence we do not fully understand, of technologies advancing fast in our ability to regulate or comprehend their consequences, we need more than ever the humility that the Titanic should have taught us. Bruce Ismay was a man of his time who made decisions that seemed reasonable within the context of that time. But context does not absolve consequences. 1,500 people still died, and those deaths still echo through history as a permanent warning about the real cost of negligence, arrogance, and placing profit above human lives. If you found this story important, if it made you think about the choices we make and their consequences, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more documented stories exploring crucial moments in history. Share with someone who needs to hear this message. And in the comments, tell me, do you think Bruce Ismay was unfairly blamed, or did he deserve to be remembered as the man who caused the death of 1,500 people? History is rarely simple, and your opinions matter. Thank you for watching until the end. Until the next story,